Hey there. Tonight, we are going to do something a little unusual and, in a quiet way, deeply human. We are going to step away from the glitter of kings and the thunder of cavalry and walk into the dim, crowded world that comes after the banners fall. We are going to visit a medieval battlefield hospital, not in the middle of the fight, but in the long, exhausted hours after the last arrow has stopped singing. We will move slowly. We will listen to the sounds. We will notice the tools, the routines, the small choices that meant the difference between pain and mercy, between infection and healing, between life and a name on a prayer list. This is history for sleep, so we will keep our pace gentle, and we will let the details settle like soft dust on stone. If you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want more nights like this. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing the quiet constellation of people around the world who fall asleep to old stories. Now dim the room. Find the cool side of the pillow. Let your shoulders drop. Breathe in and out. Good. Because tonight, we are not rushing anywhere. We are going to wander through canvas tents and smoky hearths and the low murmur of prayers. We are going to watch medieval healers do what they could with what they had. We are going to see triage, amputations, cauterization, and the slow work of preventing infection when the very air of a camp is thick with mud, sweat, and fear. We are going to follow the daily routine of Sawbones and herbalists, of monks with clean hands, of women boiling linen, of boys carrying water. And when we reach the end of the night, we will leave them with the sunrise as they count the living, cover the dead, and begin again the hard work of survival. Picture this. The battle is over, but the field is still alive. Not with marching, not with shouting orders, but with a kind of restless, injured breathing. The light is late, the sun low and red, and the air carries the smell of trampled grass and churned soil. Somewhere, a crow is already bold enough to call. The ground is uneven underfoot, and you can feel how it has been torn up, pounded by boots and hooves, gouged by spear points, soaked by rain or by blood or by both. The distance is full of silhouettes, men limping, men leaning on each other, men sitting very still because movement costs too much. And in the middle distance, beyond the densest knots of bodies, you can see the camp. Rows of tents, wagons drawn into a rough circle, cooking fires that are only now being lit, because for hours no one had time to think about bread. In many medieval armies, there was no official medical corps in the modern sense. There were no standardized uniforms with red crosses, no organized ambulance trains, no sterile operating theaters. But that does not mean there was no care. Care existed wherever people existed, in the hands of whoever had skill, steadiness, and the willingness to touch what others could not. Sometimes the healer was a barber-surgeon, a practical man who cut hair in peacetime and cut flesh in war, because he had sharp tools and a steady wrist. Sometimes the healer was a learned physician, trained in Latin texts, proud of theory, more comfortable prescribing than cutting. Sometimes the healer was a monk or a nun from a nearby religious house, someone who had tended to the sick long before the army arrived, someone who knew how to wash wounds and change linens and pray without flinching. Sometimes the healer was a woman in the camp, an herbalist, a midwife, a person with a bag of plants and the memory of what soothed fever and what slowed bleeding. And sometimes, care was simply a friend tearing a strip from a shirt and tying it tight, a brother lifting a shoulder, a stranger sharing a mouthful of water. The hospital, if we can call it that, begins as a place, a protected corner, a few tents set slightly away from the main fires, where the smoke is thinner and the traffic is less, or a barn pressed into service, or the porch of a church, if the battle happened near a village and the priest did not lock the doors. In some campaigns, especially later in the Middle Ages, certain military orders and towns did establish more formal hospitals, places with rules and beds, places like the famous hospitals run by religious communities. But on many fields, the first hospital is simply a clearing, marked by the presence of water barrels, linen bundles, and a table. You arrive at the edge of this improvised world, and the sound shifts. The battlefield behind you is scattered and wide. Here, the noise gathers. Voices overlap, not loud like combat, but urgent. A man is asking for his brother. Another is repeating a prayer under his breath as if it is a rope. Somewhere close, someone is trying to be brave and failing and then trying again. There is the clink of metal, the rattle of a wooden box, the splash of water in a basin. There is the steady instruction of an experienced hand. Hold him still. Keep his head up. Press there, not there, there. At the entrance to the treatment area, a decision is being made, again and again. Who is seen first? Who can wait? Who cannot be helped? Medieval people did not use the word triage, but the logic existed. It had to. In a mass of wounded men, time is the rarest medicine. A healer learns quickly that some wounds, though dramatic, can be managed with pressure and patience, while others, quiet and small, hide a fatal problem beneath cloth. A deep puncture near the abdomen, a pale face and a weak pulse, a cough that is too wet. The healer's eyes travel fast, skin color, breathing, the way a man holds his arm, the smell of a wound. And then the healer points. This one first, that one to the side, that one gently, that one to the far edge, where someone will sit with him and keep him company. If you look closely, you can see the categories without labels. The walking wounded hover near the outer ring. Cuts to the scalp that bled dramatically but stopped. Bruises. A shallow sword slice to the thigh that missed the great vessels. These men are frightened but upright. They can hold their own bandage. They can wait. Near the center are the serious cases. Men on stretchers made of cloaks and spear shafts, men whose legs are oddly angled, men with arrows still embedded because pulling them out wrong could do more harm. And then, at the very center, closest to the table, are the ones who are bleeding now, the ones who must be stopped quickly or they will drift away like smoke. The table is not a shining thing. It is wood. It is a door lifted off hinges. It is a plank across barrels. It is whatever was available, scrubbed as well as one can scrub in a camp. The tools are laid out on cloth. You see knives of different sizes. You see needles. You see thread that might be linen or silk. You see forceps, small pincers for gripping arrowheads or lifting a splinter of bone. You see a bowl of wine or vinegar, not for drinking but for washing. You see a small pot of honey, golden and thick, because someone knows honey can help keep a wound from going foul. You see clean strips of linen, precious as coins. And yes, you see the saw. In the medieval imagination, the barber-surgeon's saw is a symbol of blunt necessity. It is not used because the healer is cruel. It is used because crushed limbs, shattered by maces or trampled by horses, can become death traps. A bone splinters tear tissue, blood pools. The limb swells tight like a drum. Then comes blackness, then a smell, then fever. Gangrene is a word from later science, but the experience was familiar. Flesh that dies and poisons the living body. And so, sometimes, a limb is sacrificed so that a person can remain. It is a hard arithmetic, done with hands that would rather be doing something else. But before the saw comes the calmer work, cleaning, probing, assessing. A man lies on the table with an arrow in his shoulder. The shaft has been snapped shorter so he can be carried. The arrowhead is still inside. The surgeon's assistant holds a lamp close because light is everything. The surgeon feels around the wound with fingers, not to hurt, though it does, but to understand. Medieval surgery was tactile. It relied on touch, on the knowledge of texture and resistance. The surgeon uses a probe, thin metal, to trace the path. Is the arrowhead lodged against bone? Did it pass through and break? Is there a barb? Some arrowheads are designed to be hard to remove, to tear if pulled back. Sometimes the safest method is to push it through, to enlarge the exit and draw it out forward. Sometimes the method is to use forceps to grip and pull steadily, with the wound widened by a small cut. The man on the table is sweating, not from heat, but from the body's alarm. Two strong hands hold his shoulders. Someone speaks to him, low and firm, telling him to breathe, to look at a point on the tent wall, to count. 1, 2, 3. Pain control is not absent in the medieval world, but it is limited. There is no modern anesthesia. There is no gas. There is no clean syringe. But there are herbs, and there is alcohol, and there is the knowledge that a person who is calm bleeds less. Wine is offered, sometimes strong and sour. It dulls the edge. Herbal preparations exist. Poppy, henbane, mandrake, all dangerous in the wrong dose, all capable of bringing sleep or confusion. In some places, sponges soaked in narcotic mixtures were used, held to the nose to induce a kind of stupor. In other cases, the healer relies on speed, on restraint, on the hard truth that the procedure will be over sooner if the patient does not fight it. And always there is the human voice, a prayer, a song, a familiar name. When the arrow finally comes free, there is a moment of quiet relief, like a knot loosening. The surgeon presses a pad of linen to the wound. Another assistant pours wine over the area, letting it run away into a basin. Wine stings. It cleans a little. Vinegar stings more. Both are imperfect, but they are something. The surgeon checks for fragments, for splinters. Then he considers how to close the wound. In medieval surgery, suturing was known and practiced, especially for clean cuts. But punctures were tricky. Closing a deep puncture too tightly could trap corrupted matter inside, leading to swelling and fever. Some healers preferred to let such wounds drain, packing them loosely with clean cloth, changing it often. Others used poultices, mashed herbs, honey, fat, clay, depending on tradition and availability. The goal was to keep the wound clean in the medieval sense, not just free of dirt, but free of rot, free of bad smell, free of the kind of change that made flesh look wrong. The next man is carried in with a broken leg. Not a clean break, but the kind that twists. The leg is swollen, the foot pale. The healer examines quickly. Where is the break? Can it be set? Are there bone ends piercing the skin? If the skin is unbroken, the healer has a chance. With a careful pull traction, the bones can be aligned. It is slow, steady work. The patient is told to breathe, to relax, though he cannot. Assistants hold the thigh, the foot. The healer pulls, then guides the bone into place. There is a sensation, sometimes a faint click. Then comes the splint. Wood strips, bark, woven reeds, whatever is straight and firm. Linen wraps tight but not too tight. And then the most important part, stillness. A broken leg demands weeks of rest. In a campaign, rest is hard to promise. So sometimes, a broken leg is not just an injury. It is a change in a person's entire life. Beyond the central table, in the quieter ring, there are basins and benches. Here, women boil water. They add herbs to the pot, not always because herbs cure everything, but because herbs make the water smell clean, and because scent can calm. Rosemary, sage, thyme, yarrow, plantain leaves crushed to a green paste. Comfrey, called knitbone in later folk tradition, used in poultices to encourage healing. Garlic for its sharpness. Willow bark to ease pain. Honey again, because honey is both food and medicine, sticky and protective. Linen is washed, wrung out, hung near the fire. The rhythm of washing becomes a kind of metronome for the whole place. Splash, rub, twist, lay out. In the middle of chaos, routine is a small shelter. And there is the problem of cleanliness. Medieval people did not know about bacteria, but they did observe patterns. They knew that wounds that stank were dangerous. They knew that pus, laudable or not, meant something was happening. They knew that certain environments produced worse outcomes. A wound that would heal on a farm might fester in a camp. So they tried, they washed, they changed linens. They used wine, vinegar, honey. They burned filthy cloth. They kept flies away as best they could, waving branches, covering basins, moving refuse downwind. They dug latrines. They tried to keep the wounded away from the dead. The dead are everywhere nearby. That is the backdrop to every decision. Bodies lie beyond the tents, awaiting burial or burning or the hurried attention of priests. In some battles, the victorious side might bury their own and strip the enemy. In others, the field might be left for days, and the hospital becomes a thin island of effort in a sea of decay. This matters because the medieval hospital breathes the same air, the same flies, the same damp. In summer, the smell can become overwhelming. In winter, the cold preserves bodies but also chills the wounded, slowing their blood, making shock more likely. The healer has to work with the season, with weather, with the simple fact that nature does not pause for war. Now come a little closer, but in your mind, keep a respectful distance. We will watch one of the most feared procedures, but we will do it gently without dwelling on gore. A man is brought in with a forearm that has been crushed, perhaps by a mace or by a horse's hoof. The bones are shattered. The hand is cold. The skin is mottled. The surgeon has already seen this pattern. If the limb is left, infection is likely. And infection in a medieval camp is a predator. The surgeon speaks with the patient, or with the patient's friends if the patient is too far gone. There is no paperwork. There is no consent form. But there is a moment of understanding, a moment when everyone around the table knows what is about to happen. The patient is given wine, perhaps also a small dose of a sleeping herb. Someone places a piece of leather or wood between the teeth. Assistants hold the arm. The surgeon wraps a cord above the injury tight to slow bleeding. This is a tourniquet, though not called that. Then the surgeon makes a circular cut through skin and muscle, quick and practiced. Medieval surgeons knew that speed mattered. They had to. Then the saw comes. It is not a modern, fine-toothed instrument, but it cuts. The sound is unforgettable in the imagination, a rough rasp against bone. But the surgeon does not linger. Once the bone is through, the surgeon ties off visible vessels with thread or cauterizes with a hot iron. Cauterization is both feared and valued. The iron, heated in the fire until it is the color of a sunset, is pressed briefly to the bleeding point. It sears. It seals. It also wounds in its own way. but it stops the flow. After the limb is removed, the stump is treated. The surgeon may trim jagged bone. He may pull skin over the end to create a cushion, sewing it with a needle and thread. He may leave the wound partially open to drain. He may apply honey or a poultice. Then the patient is carried away, pale and shaking, to a quieter place where the real test begins. Not the procedure, but survival afterward. Shock, blood loss, infection, the body's response, the patient's will, the care of those around him. If you listen closely, you can hear that the screams are not constant. They come in waves, tied to procedures, tied to moments. In between, there is a different sound, the low murmur of conversation, the instruction, the prayer. A monk walks slowly between the wounded, offering water and words. In some camps, clergy were central to this work, not only because they cared about souls, but because monasteries had experience with illness. The Benedictine rule encouraged care for the sick. Many monasteries had infirmaries. Monks learned how to prepare simple medicines, how to keep records, how to maintain cleanliness within their walls. When war came, that knowledge could spill outward imperfectly into the field. And sometimes, the hospital is literally attached to a religious house. Imagine a small priory near the road. The battle has happened close enough that the wounded are brought there. The monks open their gate. The infirmary fills. Straw pallets are laid on the floor. Candles burn late. The chapel becomes a place of both prayer and triage. The sacred and the practical blend. A man may receive confession and a bandage in the same hour. A woman may whisper a psalm while boiling water. In a world where death is always near, this blending feels natural. The tools of the healer tell stories. There is the scalpel, simple. There is the lancet, used for bloodletting, because medieval medicine was deeply shaped by humoral theory, the idea that health depended on balance. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. A learned physician might insist that fever is excess heat and moisture, that bloodletting will restore equilibrium. A practical surgeon might roll his eyes but still do it, because sometimes lowering pressure can make a person feel relief, and because tradition carries authority. There are cupping glasses used to draw blood to the surface. There are leeches sometimes kept in a jar. There are probes and spatula. There are small spoons for scraping. There are bowls and mortars for grinding herbs. And there is the most important tool of all, clean cloth if you can get it. Infections are the shadow that never leaves. In a modern hospital, we talk about antisepsis, antibiotics. In a medieval camp, the healer watches for signs. Redness spreading, swelling that becomes tight, heat in the skin, a smell that turns sweet and wrong, a fever that climbs. If a wound begins to rot, the healer may try to open it to drain. He may wash with wine or vinegar. He may apply honey. He may apply a poultice of herbs known to draw out corruption, like onion, garlic, or certain resins. He may use cautery again, not only to stop bleeding but to burn away foul tissue. He may pray, and he may accept that sometimes the body will not be saved. But it is not all failure. People did survive. Many wounds that look dramatic in stories are survivable with basic care. Cleaning, pressure, rest, nourishment. Medieval people knew how to set bones, how to stitch cuts, how to treat burns. They knew that clean water mattered. They knew that certain foods helped strength return. They knew that sleep, when possible, was healing. The limitation was not always knowledge. It was circumstance. War, dirt, movement, hunger, cold. Let's step deeper into the night, because this is when the hospital truly becomes itself. Daylight fades. Torches are lit, smoky and flickering. The tent walls glow orange from within. Shadows move. The healers' faces look older in this light. Outside, the camp settles into a low hum. Guards calling, horses shifting, men cooking thin stew. Inside, the work continues. There is no shift change. There is only endurance. A clerk, if the army has one, might try to record names. Sometimes this was done for pay, for ration lists, for letters home. More often, the wounded become anonymous to history. A man with a cut on his cheek. A man with an arrow wound in the thigh. A boy with a broken collarbone. A knight with a dented helmet and a concussion, dizzy, nauseated. Not bleeding but not right. Concussions were not understood as we understand them, but symptoms were observed. The healer might recommend darkness, quiet, water. In a camp, darkness is available, but quiet is rare. Near the back, there is a fire pit with a pot simmering. The smell is earthy. Someone is making a decoction, herbs steeped in hot water meant to be sipped by those with fever or stomach trouble. Yarrow for bleeding, mint for nausea, fennel, chamomile. The exact recipe depends on region and tradition. In some places, healers used imported spices, expensive and rare, like cinnamon or cloves, believed to strengthen the heart and ward off corruption. In other places, the pharmacy was the hedgerow. Either way, the act of making the drink is comforting. It is a small ritual of care, and rituals matter. We can also notice the social geography of the hospital. Rank does not disappear. A noble might be treated on a cleaner pallet, with more attendants. A common soldier might be placed on straw near the door. But in moments of crisis, the body's needs can flatten hierarchy. Blood looks the same. Pain sounds the same. A healer focused on the work may not care who the patient is. The healer cares about what is possible. That said, resources follow power. A wealthy man might have his own physician. He might carry medicines. He might have servants who can keep him clean and fed. A poor man depends on the kindness of strangers and the basic provisions of the camp. The hospital also includes the invisible labor of those not called healers. The boy who runs for water again and again. his arms aching from the bucket handle. The woman who scrubs blood from cloth until her fingers wrinkle. The cook who thickens broth for the wounded, adding fat when possible because fat means calories, and calories mean healing. The blacksmith who sharpens blades and heats irons, not only for weapons but for cautery. The carpenter who adjusts splints. The priest who sits with the dying so they are not alone. The friend who holds a hand through fever. This is a community, temporary and strained but real. Now, let's move to one of the most common and haunting injuries of medieval war: wounds to the head. Helmets existed, yes, but they were not universal, and even a helmet could be dented. A sword might slice the scalp. An axe might crack the skull. A stone from a sling could strike temple. Head wounds bleed intensely. The scalp is rich with vessels, so a shallow cut can look catastrophic. That is both frightening and, sometimes, oddly helpful, because it means the bleeding is visible and can be addressed with pressure and stitching. A man sits on a bench, head bowed, hair matted. The healer parts the hair and examines the cut. If it is superficial, it can be cleaned and stitched. Needles thread. If the cut is deeper, exposing bone, the healer becomes more cautious. Bone infection is deadly. If the skull is fractured and pressing on the brain, symptoms might include confusion, vomiting, seizures. Medieval surgeons did sometimes practice trepanation, drilling or cutting a small hole in the skull to relieve pressure. This is an ancient procedure, done in many cultures, sometimes successfully. On the battlefield, it would be rare and risky, but in a more stable setting, it could be attempted. Imagine the tension in the tent if trepanation is considered. The healer must decide: is the patient likely to die without intervention? Is the fracture depressed? Is there evidence of pressure? If so, the healer might shave the area, clean it, and use a specialized instrument, a trephine, to cut a circular piece of bone. The idea is to let swelling expand outward rather than crushing the brain. The procedure is delicate. Infection risk is enormous, but sometimes it worked. Sometimes a person lived, carrying a scar and a story. In the medieval world, survival itself could feel like a miracle. Then there are the chest wounds. A spear thrust between ribs, an arrow that went deep. These are the wounds the healer fears most, because internal bleeding cannot be stopped by pressure alone. A patient might be able to talk, might even joke, and then suddenly grow pale, breathing shallow, and be gone. The healer might try to keep the person warm. He might sit them upright to ease breathing. He might apply compresses. He might pray, but there is little to do. In these cases, the hospital becomes not a place of cure, but of comfort. Comfort is a kind of medicine. In a world without antibiotics, comfort is not a luxury. It is a tool. A calm patient breathes better. A patient who is not alone fights longer. A patient who can sleep, even in short fragments, may heal. So the medieval hospital is full of small comforts. Water on lips, cloth on forehead, a blanket, a whispered story. If you think of medieval life as brutal, and it could be, remember also that tenderness existed, because tenderness is part of being human. It just did not always get written down. As the night deepens, the hospital's routine becomes more organized. The most urgent cases are addressed first. The walking wounded are sent away with instructions. Keep it clean, change the cloth, come back if fever. Some men are given simple salves, animal fat mixed with herbs, resinous ointments. There might be a jar of something like beeswax and oil used to protect skin. Wounds are bandaged. Splints are checked. The dead are moved quietly because space is needed, and because the living cannot heal when surrounded by bodies. The dead are covered with cloth if cloth can be spared. Outside, the cold might creep in. The tent flaps move with wind. The fire must be fed. An assistant dozes upright for a moment, then wakes, embarrassed, and returns to work. The surgeon's hands are stained. He washes them in a basin, scrubbing with sand or ash because soap is scarce. Even so, the stains remain. The smell of iron is in the air, not only from blood but from tools. We can pause here and talk about the knowledge systems that shaped medieval medicine, because understanding the mindset makes the scene feel more real. Medieval medicine in Europe was influenced by ancient Greek and Roman texts, especially those associated with Hippocrates and Galen. These texts described the body as a balance of humors. Disease was imbalance. Treatment aimed to restore balance through diet, regimen, bloodletting, purging, and topical applications. Learned physicians, trained at universities, emphasized theory, astrology, and complex diagnoses. They might read urine in a flask, looking at color and sediment, and make a judgment about internal heat. Surgeons, by contrast, were often trained through apprenticeship. They learned by doing. They dealt with wounds, fractures, abscesses. They were practical. In some places, surgeons were organized into guilds. Barbers, too, formed guilds. Over time, surgery gained respect, especially as war made its necessity obvious. On a battlefield, theory and practice meet. A physician might argue about humors. A surgeon might say, yes, but the arrow is still in him. And so they work, sometimes together, sometimes in tension. Herbal knowledge was another layer, often held by women and by monastic communities. Gardens grew medicinal plants. Recipes were passed down. Not all of it was effective in a modern sense, but some of it was. Honey, as we said, has real antibacterial properties. Wine and vinegar can reduce contamination. Certain plants can reduce pain or inflammation. The medieval world was not ignorant. It was constrained by the limits of the era's technology and microbiology. Within those constraints, people learned. They observed. They adapted. Now let's follow a particular healer, a composite figure, because it helps to anchor the night. We will call him Martin, a barber-surgeon in his middle years. His hands are broad. His fingernails are short. He wears a leather apron that has seen too many stains. In his satchel, he carries his tools wrapped in cloth. He also carries small jars of salve, a roll of thread, a whetstone, and a small prayer bead, because even practical men in the Middle Ages lived in a spiritual world. Martin moves from patient to patient. He is efficient but not cold. He has learned to speak in a steady tone. He has learned to ignore the worst sounds without ignoring the person making them. He has learned that if he hesitates, fear spreads. So he does not hesitate. He chooses. He acts. When a wound is beyond help, he signals to a monk and the monk comes and Martin moves on. This is not cruelty. It is triage without the word, a grim kindness to the many. At one point, Martin pauses at a young soldier with a deep cut on the hand. The hand is not life-threatening, but it matters. A hand is livelihood. Martin cleans the wound, aligns the edges and stitches carefully. He tells the boy to keep it wrapped, to keep it dry, to avoid dirt. The boy nods, eyes wide. He is not thinking about infection theory. He is thinking about whether he will be able to hold a spoon, a plow, a sword. Martin knows this. He ties the bandage with extra care. In that moment, the hospital is not only about survival, it is about the shape of a future. Later, Martin deals with a problem that every battlefield hospital faces: thirst. The wounded ask for water constantly, but too much water too fast can make a shocked body vomit. Also, water itself might be unsafe. In a medieval camp, water comes from streams, wells, barrels. It can be contaminated, so water is rationed. Sometimes it is mixed with wine, not only for taste but because wine is safer. Sometimes it is boiled if there is time. The boy with the bucket becomes important. He learns where the cleanest water is. He learns which barrel is for washing wounds and which is for drinking. The hospital's survival depends on these small logistics. And then there is the problem of food. Healing requires calories and protein. But in war, food is uncertain. The wounded might be given broth, soft bread, eggs if available. A noble might have meat. A common soldier might get thin porridge. Monastic infirmaries often had special diets for the sick. They might provide white bread rather than coarse. They might allow meat for the ill even if fasting rules applied to others. In the camp, such rules bend. The body needs what it needs. The night goes on, and in the quiet moments we can step outside the tent and listen to the larger camp. The battle's excitement has drained away, leaving exhaustion. Fires crackle. Horses stamp, men murmur. Somewhere a minstrel might play a soft tune not to entertain but to soothe. Somewhere else a man weeps. Somewhere a messenger rides away with news. And in the center the hospital glows like a lantern, a small point of concentrated human effort. Now, let's gently explore another common procedure, cauterization, beyond its role in amputation. Medieval healers used cautery for bleeding, yes, but also for certain kinds of wounds and ulcers. The idea was to seal, to stop corruption, to create a barrier. The iron is heated, then applied briefly. It is painful. It can cause further tissue damage. But in an era with limited alternatives, it could save a life by stopping hemorrhage. Some surgeons also used boiling oil, particularly in later periods when gunshot wounds appeared, and people believed powder poison required harsh measures. But on many medieval fields, hot iron was the primary cautery. You can see the cautery iron near the fire, its handle wrapped in cloth so the surgeon can hold it. An assistant tends it, watching for the right heat. Not too cool or it will not seal. Not too hot or it will char excessively. In that attention, you see craft. Even this feared tool has technique. Now think about the smell. It is not only blood, it is smoke, it is sweat, it is vinegar, it is wet wool, it is damp earth brought in on boots, it is herbs crushed between fingers. And underneath, always, it is the smell of bodies, alive and stressed. Medieval people lived with strong smells. They did not have deodorant. They did not have plastic barriers. They had wool and leather and wood and fire. Their world was sensory. The hospital is sensory too. As hours pass, some patients drift into sleep, not peaceful like your sleep, but heavy, exhausted. Others cannot sleep because pain keeps them bright and tense. A monk walks among them with a small lamp, checking bandages, offering sips of water. A woman adjusts a blanket. Someone wipes a forehead. The small acts continue. The routine becomes: check bleeding, check breathing, check fever, change cloth, empty basins, feed fire, boil water, grind herbs. Again, again. We can also talk about the role of superstition and spiritual practice, because in the medieval mind, illness and injury were not purely physical. They had meaning. A wound might be seen as God's judgment or God's test or simply fate. Saints were invoked. Relics might be brought. A wounded man might clutch a medal of Saint Sebastian, patron associated with arrows. He might ask for Saint Roch, later linked with plague. He might ask for Mary. The healer might not mock this. The healer might encourage it because belief can steady a heart. Sometimes charms were used, words spoken over a wound, a strip of parchment with a prayer, an amulet. From a modern perspective, these do not heal tissue. But from a human perspective, they can calm, and calm can matter. Also, some charms were simply mnemonic devices for practical instructions, embedded in ritual. Near midnight, the flow of new wounded slows. Those who could walk have either made it or not. Those who were far out on the field are being found now, if at all. Lanterns bob in the distance as scavengers and helpers search among bodies. This is one of the darkest parts of a medieval battle, and not just literally. The wounded who lay unseen for hours are cold, dehydrated, shocked. Some have bled into the earth. Some are still alive but fading. When they are carried in now, the healer's faces tighten. Late arrivals are harder to save. A man is brought in with a leg wound that has been bleeding slowly for hours. The cloth around it is soaked and stiff. When it is removed, the wound is messy. Dirt has entered. The healer washes with warm water, then wine, then applies pressure. If the bleeding is from a large vessel, the healer may need to clamp and tie. Medieval surgeons did ligate vessels, though it became more systematized later. They also used compressive bandaging. They might pack a wound with cloth. They might, in desperation, cauterize. The decision is quick and heavy. Sometimes the hospital has to deal with the enemy wounded as well. If a battle was close and messy, wounded men from both sides may be carried in, especially if they are local, or if the victor is merciful, or if a ransom is possible for noble prisoners. The ethics of medieval warfare were complex. Chivalric ideals existed, but so did hatred. In a chaotic camp, mercy depends on leadership and on resources. Even when mercy is offered, the enemy wounded may be guarded, kept apart. A healer might treat them anyway, because a healer's identity can transcend politics, or because it is practical to keep a valuable prisoner alive. Now let's take a slow tour of the objects around us, as if we are walking through a small museum of the night. There is a wooden chest with compartments, needles, thread, small bottles. There is a leather roll holding knives. There are bowls, some pewter, some clay. There are bundles of linen, some clean, some stained. There is a bucket for waste. There is straw on the ground, replaced when it becomes too soaked. There are candles, precious. There is a Bible or a psalter used by a monk. There is a rosary. There is a small bell rung if someone dies or if help is needed. There is a stack of splints. There is a pot of pitch or resin used for certain dressings. There is a jar of fat. There is a bundle of dried herbs. There is a whetstone. Each object is simple. Together they form a system. The medieval healer's greatest enemy is not only infection but time. Wounds need care for days, but armies move. Camps pack up. The battlefield hospital is temporary. So what happens to the wounded when dawn comes? Some will be transported in wagons to towns, to monasteries, to castles. Some will be left with local communities. Some will die. Some will recover enough to hobble. This transition is a second phase of triage. Who is worth transporting? Who has a chance? Who can be left with food and instructions? The healer becomes, briefly, a logistics officer. At dawn, the light changes again. The tent becomes less dramatic, more ordinary. The work is still there, but now you can see the dirt clearly. You can see the dried blood on wood. You can see how little space there is. The healers' faces are gray with fatigue. Their eyes are red. They have been working for 10, 12, 14 hours. Their bodies ache, and yet some of them feel a quiet pride, not in war but in what they did against its consequences. They saved some. They eased suffering. They prevented some infections. They gave water. They held hands. They did something. Now, because this is a long sleep story, we will not end quickly. We will continue our walk, but we will slow even more, and we will let the hospital's day routine unfold. Because a battlefield hospital is not only a night of emergency, it is also a morning of cleaning and a day of slow nursing. As the sun rises, the first task is sanitation. Basins are emptied. Cloth is sorted. The most stained cloth may be burned because washing it might not be worth the water. The remaining cloth is boiled because boiling makes it feel safe, even if the reasons are not fully understood. Straw is replaced. Flies are fought with smoke and movement. Food is brought in. The wounded who can sit are encouraged to do so because moving helps lungs. The wounded who must stay still are checked for sores. Pressure sores were known, though not named, and turning patients mattered. In monastic infirmaries, there were routines for this. In a camp, routines are harder but still attempted. A woman, perhaps a laundress, perhaps a camp follower who has become a nurse by necessity, goes from pallet to pallet with a bowl of warm water and cloth. She washes faces. She washes hands. She wipes away sweat. She does this not only for comfort but because cleanliness is dignity. The medieval world could be harsh, but it also valued dignity, especially in suffering. A man who has lost a leg is still a man. He is not only a wound, he is a person who wants to be seen. Pain management continues. A patient with a fresh amputation stump might be given a stronger drink. A patient with fever might be cooled with damp cloths. A patient who cannot sleep might be given an herbal sedative cautiously. The healer watches for breathing to slow too much. Dosing is risky. Medieval healers knew their remedies could harm. They balanced. They relied on experience. Infections, again, are monitored. The healer checks for swelling. He checks for heat. He smells the bandage when it is removed. Smell was a diagnostic tool. If a wound smells sweet, it might be dangerous. If it smells like decay, the healer worries. If it smells like nothing, that is good. The healer might decide to open the wound to let it drain. Medieval medicine often favored drainage for abscesses. A surgeon might lance. He might apply a drawing poultice. He might use onion and garlic wrapped in cloth. He might use resin because resin is sticky and protective. He might use honey. These are choices that have echoes in modern wound care, though not perfectly. Let's listen to the language in the tent. A surgeon uses plain speech. A monk uses prayer. A patient uses whatever words he has. Some men are stoic. Some are angry. Some joke. Humor exists in hospitals, even medieval ones, because humor is a defense against fear. A man might say, "Well, I won't need to buy shoes anymore." Another might say, "I'll be the fastest runner in heaven because I'll be whole again there." The monk might smile sadly. The surgeon might not smile, but he might appreciate the courage. The tools are cleaned, as best as possible. A knife is wiped, washed, maybe heated briefly. A saw is scrubbed. A needle is wiped. There is no true sterilization, but there is cleaning. The healer knows that a filthy tool can cause problems. Even without germ theory, they observed that cleanliness mattered. In some traditions, surgeons were advised to keep their instruments clean and sharp, and to avoid working with dirty hands. Monastic settings were generally cleaner than camps, which is one reason monastery hospitals sometimes had better outcomes. We can also step for a moment into the mindset of the patient. Imagine being a medieval soldier, injured, lying in a tent, hearing the moans of others. Your body hurts. You are thirsty. You do not know if you will live. You might think about home. You might think about God. You might think about whether your Lord will pay you if you survive. You might worry about your wife, your children, your parents. You might worry about being unable to work. Disability was common in medieval society, from war, from accidents, from disease. Communities adapted. Families adapted. There were beggars, yes, but there were also craftsmen who worked with one hand, farmers who used crutches, people who adjusted their lives. Still, fear is real. The hospital is not only physical repair, it is a place where futures shift. Now, let's gently broaden the lens and talk about different kinds of medieval battlefield care across regions and centuries. Because the Middle Ages lasted a long time, and practices varied. In early medieval Europe, after Rome's collapse, large organized armies were less common, and battles were often smaller, though still deadly. Medical care would be local and ad hoc. As time went on, and as kingdoms centralized and wars became larger, especially in the High Middle Ages, you see more organization. Towns formed militias. Kings hired mercenaries. Military orders like the Hospitallers became prominent, running hospitals that cared for pilgrims and the sick and, at times, the wounded. The very name Hospitaller tells you something. Hospitality, care. In crusading contexts, hospitals in places like Jerusalem became sophisticated for their time, with large wards, regular routines, and attention to diet and cleanliness. In Islamic lands, medicine was also advanced in many ways, with hospitals, scholars, and surgical knowledge. There was cross-cultural exchange. Surgical instruments and texts moved. Herbal knowledge moved. Ideas about contagion and hygiene varied. The medieval world was interconnected more than we sometimes imagine. A surgeon in Europe might use techniques described in texts that had traveled through Arabic translations. A physician might consult a compendium that included knowledge from many cultures. The battlefield hospital, therefore, is not isolated. It is part of a broader history of medicine. But no matter the region, certain realities remain. Blood loss is dangerous. Infection is dangerous. Pain is intense. Clean water is precious. Rest is vital. Social support matters. These are universal. The medieval healer in any culture is wrestling with the same enemies, using the tools of the time. Now, come back to our tent because the details are where sleep stories live. It is late morning now. Sunlight filters through the canvas. Dust dances in the beams. A man with a bandaged head is awake, staring at the ceiling. A man with a splinted leg is asleep, mouth open, breathing shallow. A man with a stitched hand is eating bread soaked in broth. A man with an amputation stump is staring at where his limb used to be, expression distant. A monk sits beside him, not talking, just present. Presence is its own medicine. In the corner, an herbalist is preparing a fresh poultice. She grinds dried yarrow in a mortar, adds a bit of honey, a bit of fat, stirs until it becomes a paste. She spreads it on cloth. She carries it to a patient with a shallow but dirty wound on the shin. She cleans the wound gently with warm water, then wine, then lays the poultice, wraps it. The patient sighs because the paste is cool. Coolness feels like relief. The herbalist's hands are sure. She has done this before, perhaps not for battle wounds, but for farm injuries, for kitchen cuts, for infected splinters. War is only an extreme version of everyday injury. A learned physician enters, perhaps attached to a noble. He wears a robe, not an apron. He carries a small book. He asks about the noble patient. He examines the urine flask. He speaks of heat and moisture. He prescribes a regimen, cool drinks, light foods, rest, perhaps bloodletting if fever rises. The barber-surgeon listens politely. They are different kinds of practitioners. In some contexts, they compete. In others, they complement. The physician might help with fever management and diet. The surgeon handles the knife. Outside, wagons are being prepared. The army may move soon. The wounded who can be transported must be loaded. This is painful. Being jostled on a cart with a broken limb is agony. So someone tries to pad the cart with straw. Someone tries to tie the patient so he will not fall. Someone gives wine before the journey. A nurse wraps extra cloth around wounds. A monk gives a blessing. The cart creaks. It rolls out of camp, heading toward a town or monastery where longer care might be possible. Some wounded are left behind. Perhaps the local village is ordered to care for them. Perhaps a ransom arrangement is made. Perhaps a religious house agrees to take them. Medieval communities often bore the cost of war in this way. feeding and nursing men they did not choose to fight. This is the hidden economy of conflict. The battlefield hospital is not only a scene, it is a burden that spreads outward into households and monasteries. Now, let's spend time with a concept that matters deeply to medieval medicine: the idea of good and bad wounds. Medieval healers often described wounds in terms of whether they were clean, whether they were simple or compound, whether they were fresh or old, whether they were corrupted. A clean sword cut might be considered simple and treatable. A jagged wound from a mace or from a barbed arrow might be considered more dangerous because it crushed tissue and created pockets where corruption could gather. Dirt and cloth fibers inside a wound were feared, so healers tried to remove foreign matter. They probed, they washed, they sometimes used suction. They sometimes used poultices that would adhere to debris. In later centuries, surgeons like those in the Renaissance wrote detailed manuals on wound care, building on medieval practice. We can also note the importance of the seasons again. In summer, infection risk rises because heat accelerates decay and flies multiply. In winter, the cold reduces fly activity but increases the risk of hypothermia and frostbite. A wounded man can die simply from being too cold. So blankets matter, fires matter, keeping a patient dry matters. Wet wool steals heat. Straw insulation helps. In a medieval camp, these are constant concerns. Let's talk about one more tool: the needle and thread. Sewing a wound sounds simple, but it requires judgment. If a wound is too dirty, sewing it closed can trap infection. If a wound is clean and edges align, sewing can speed healing and reduce scarring. Medieval surgeons used different stitches. They might use a curved needle. They might use linen thread. They might use silk for finer work, if available. They might also use pins like small metal clips to hold wound edges, especially in larger cuts, with thread looped around. These techniques existed. The medieval world was inventive. Now, because this is a 2-hour sleep journey, we will let ourselves drift into a slower, almost meditative tour of the hospital's sensory landscape, repeating themes in a gentle way, like a lullaby. The tent's canvas is rough under fingertips. The ground is packed earth, uneven. Straw crackles softly when someone shifts. The fire pops and hisses when fat drips. A pot simmers. The smell of rosemary rises. Someone coughs. Someone whispers. Someone prays. Tools clink. Water pours. Cloth tears. A bandage wraps. A knot is tied. A breath is taken. A breath is released. This is the rhythm of survival. We can imagine the healer's hands again, stained, tired, careful. The healer is not a hero in shining armor. The healer is a worker. The healer does not win glory on the field. The healer does something quieter. In many medieval chronicles, healers are invisible. But in the reality of war, they are crucial. Without them, armies lose men not only to battle but to infection and disability. Leaders who understood this sometimes invested in care. Others did not. Over time, military medicine slowly evolved, pushed by necessity. In some late medieval and early modern contexts, you begin to see more organized field hospitals, particularly in large conflicts. You see the use of wagons for transport. You see rules for camp sanitation. You see surgeons attached to units. But even earlier on many fields, the basic elements are present: triage, cleaning, splinting, amputation, cautery, nursing. The medieval battlefield hospital is therefore both primitive and sophisticated. Primitive by modern standards, sophisticated for what it is: a human system improvising under extreme pressure. Now, let's quietly walk through a few more patient stories, not to dramatize, but to show the range of care. A man with a deep cut on the thigh is treated. The surgeon inspects for major vessel damage. He applies pressure. He uses a bandage tied tight. He tells the man to keep the leg elevated to avoid walking. The man nods, but later he will have to walk anyway because the army moves. Risk returns. A man with an arrow through the calf is treated. The arrow is removed carefully. The wound is left to drain. Honey is applied. The man is told to rest. He is given willow bark tea for pain. He tries to sleep. A man with a crushed rib is treated. The healer cannot set ribs easily. He recommends rest, slow breathing, warm compresses. The man coughs and winces. If the rib punctured a lung, he may not survive. The healer watches. A man with a facial wound is treated. The wound is cleaned. Stitches are placed carefully because faces heal and scarring changes identity. The surgeon knows this. He takes time, even in chaos, because faces matter in a social world. A man with a small, deep puncture near the belly is treated. The healer is uneasy. The puncture looks minor, but the man is pale and sweating. The healer knows internal injury may be fatal. He gives water slowly. He keeps the man warm. He asks a monk to stay. The man may die quietly. And then there is the quiet work of preventing infection in the long term. Bandages must be changed. Wounds must be inspected. Patients must be fed. Water must be kept clean. Waste must be removed. Flies must be controlled. These tasks are not glamorous, but they are the difference between survival and death. In monastic hospitals, rules existed for cleanliness. In some urban hospitals, there were ward routines, bed spacing, laundering. On a field, space is tight, but the impulse toward routine still appears because humans create order when they can. Let's pause and consider the emotional landscape for the healers themselves. Medieval healers were not immune to fear. They could catch diseases. They could be blamed if a noble died. They could be attacked by angry relatives. They could be overwhelmed. Yet they returned to the table. Why? sometimes for pay. Surgeons were paid sometimes well, sometimes for patronage. Serving a lord could bring status, sometimes from religious duty. Caring for the sick was a corporal work of mercy, sometimes from simple human decency. Whatever the motive, the act remains. They touched wounds. We can also think about the training of a barber-surgeon. Apprenticeship began young. A boy might learn to sharpen razors, to mix salves, to hold instruments, to restrain patients. He would watch procedures. He would practice on animals, perhaps, or on cadavers if available, though dissection was limited and culturally constrained in many places. Over years, the boy would gain skill. On a battlefield, that apprenticeship becomes intense. There is no slow learning. There is only doing. Now the afternoon comes. The sun is high. The camp is active again. The wounded who remain are quieter, either sleeping or fading. The healers take turns eating something quickly. Bread, cheese, thin meat. They drink water mixed with ale. They wipe their mouths and return. The day is not over. It will not be over for days, because this video is titled A Medieval Battlefield Hospital. Screams, Sawbones, and Survival. We should also talk about survival outcomes, gently and realistically. Many wounded did survive, especially those with limb injuries that were treated quickly and kept relatively clean. Amputees could survive, though infection risk was high. Fractures could heal if kept immobilized. Head wounds could heal if superficial. However, abdominal wounds were often fatal. Deep chest wounds were often fatal. Infection could turn a minor injury into a death sentence. Fever could sweep through the camp. Dysentery, typhus, other diseases could appear because war camps are crowded and sanitation is poor. So sometimes, the hospital treats not only battle wounds but camp illnesses. Diarrhea, coughs, fevers, infected blisters, trench foot-like conditions, though not named. The healer is busy even when no battle is fought. As evening approaches again, the hospital prepares for another night, even if no battle comes. Bandages are changed before dark. Fires are stocked. Water is boiled. Herbs are portioned. The routine continues. In the medieval world, time is cyclical, tied to daylight. The hospital is a small world with its own cycle. Urgent work at night, cleaning in morning, nursing through day, preparation at dusk. Now, let's gently shift from the immediate hospital to the broader idea of how medieval society understood hospitals and care. The concept of hospital in the medieval period often meant a place of hospitality, a place that received travelers, the poor, the sick. Many hospitals were religious foundations. They were charitable institutions. They provided beds, food, spiritual care. Some specialized. Leper houses, for instance, separated those with leprosy from the community, both out of fear and out of a kind of protective logic. Other hospitals served pilgrims. In crusading contexts, hospitals became large and organized, like the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, famed for its scale and care. These institutions created models of nursing that could influence battlefield care indirectly, through personnel and practice. On the battlefield, however, the hospital is improvised. It borrows from whatever is nearby: a monastery infirmary, a town hall, a barn. The language of charity and mercy travels with it. Even hardened soldiers respected the idea that the wounded should be tended, at least on their own side. This is part of the slow development of wartime ethics. Not consistent, not universal, but present. Now, as we move toward the gentle end of our journey, we will return once more to the beginning image, the field after battle, and the small island of light in the camp. Because there is something quietly profound about this scene. War is destruction. Medicine is repair. In the medieval world, repair was difficult, often incomplete, but it existed. The hospital is where the human impulse to mend reveals itself. Imagine, then, the second dawn after the battle. The hospital has been functioning for more than a day. Some patients have been transported. Some have died. Some are improving. A man with a stitched hand can flex his fingers slightly. A man with a splinted leg has less swelling. A man with a head wound has no fever. Small victories. The healers, exhausted, feel these victories like warm stones in their pockets. They cannot stop the war, but they can save one person, then another. A monk rings a bell softly for morning prayer. Some patients try to sit up, some cannot. The monk speaks words of comfort, not only about death but about endurance. A nurse brings broth. The taste is bland, but it is food. A surgeon checks a stump and nods because it is not swollen, because it smells clean, because there is hope. Outside, the army may be leaving. The banners fold. The wagons creak. The horses are harnessed. The hospital, too, may move, shrinking back into boxes and bundles, leaving behind stained straw and trampled ground. If the hospital is attached to a monastery, it will remain, now filled with wounded men whose stories will blend into the monastery's long record of care. If the hospital is purely a field tent, it will vanish, and only the healed bodies and the graves will mark that it ever existed. And now, as you lie there listening, safe in your own time, let this thought settle gently. The medieval battlefield hospital was not a place of modern miracles, but it was a place of stubborn effort. It was a place where people washed wounds with wine because it was all they had, where they used honey because someone had noticed it helped, where they set bones with splints because straight wood and patience could restore a limb, where they amputated because they understood in hard experience that dead flesh could kill, where they prayed because prayer was part of the world's fabric, where they comforted because comfort is timeless. So, as we close, imagine the tent at night one last time, The fire is lower now. The tools are put away. A basin is emptied. A bandage is tied. A voice murmurs a prayer. A wounded man exhales and finally sleeps. The healer leans back for a moment, eyes closing. Outside, the wind moves through grass that has already begun to forget the stamp of hooves. Somewhere, a bird calls. Somewhere, a cartwheel creaks on the road. And the long medieval world, with all its hardship and resilience, continues. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of the hospital fade into the distance like a lantern carried down a path. You are safe. You are warm. And the story is done for tonight. Before we even enter the hospital, let's rewind just a little, because what happens after the battle is shaped by what happens before it. Medieval armies rarely marched with the expectation of comfort. They traveled with wagons full of grain, barrels, spare bowstrings, tent poles, and all the ordinary things people need to stay alive on the road. Somewhere among those wagons, often without much fanfare, traveled the objects that would become a hospital. Not a building, not a fixed place, but a set of supplies and habits. Cloth for bandages, needles and thread, knives, basins, a mortar for grinding herbs, maybe a small chest of salves, and above all, people who knew how to use them. On the morning of a battle, while knights tightened straps and archers tested strings, the healers and helpers were already thinking about shade, water, and distance. Too close to the fighting, and you risk chaos. Too far, and the wounded will not reach you in time. So they chose a spot, often behind a rise, near a stream if possible, near a road if retreat becomes necessary. They raised a tent or claimed a barn, and they prepared. They stacked clean straw. They arranged buckets. They laid out cloth. They sharpened knives. They built a fire and placed an iron in the coals, because everyone knew that when the bleeding begins, you will want heat. Even if no one says it aloud, even if everyone tries to believe the battle will be quick, the hospital is a quiet admission that bodies break. And while the battle is still an argument at a distance, the hospital has its own smaller rhythms. Someone boils water. Someone tears linen into strips, not too narrow, not too wide. Someone checks the knots on splints, because a splint is only as good as its binding. Someone grinds dried herbs into powder, the scent rising like crushed summer. In many traditions, yarrow is for bleeding, plantain is for drawing and soothing, comfrey is for knitting, sage is for cleansing, and honey is for almost everything, because honey is both sweet and stubborn. There is a practical poetry to these preparations. They are small, repetitive, almost meditative. They are the opposite of war's sudden violence. They are, in their own way, a form of prayer. Now the battle happens, and you, in this story, do not have to watch it closely. You only need to know that it ends the way battles often end. Not with a neat conclusion, but with exhaustion. The shouting thins. The clash becomes scattered. Then there is a silence that feels strange, like the world holding its breath. And that is when the hospital begins, truly begins. Because now the wounded start arriving in a trickle and then a rush. Men come in supported by friends, leaning hard, boots dragging. Others are carried on doors, on cloaks, on ladders. Some are brought on carts, and every bump is a groan. The first wave is usually the men who can move. They come fast and they fill the edges. The second wave is the men who cannot move. They arrive slower and they demand more. In the earliest moments, the hospital is almost like a market of suffering. People talk over each other. Someone demands water. Someone insists he is fine even as blood runs down his sleeve. Someone is furious, shouting at no one because anger feels better than fear. The healers impose order. They do it with voice and gesture. They point. They touch. They make quick decisions. They send some men away with a cloth and a knot. They pull others closer. They choose which wounds will be examined first. And they learn, again, that dramatic wounds are not always the worst. A scalp cut bleeds like a fountain and looks like death, but it can often be stitched. A small puncture near the belly might look like nothing and be fatal. A pale man who is quiet may be closer to death than a man who is screaming. The healer watches for pallor, for cold skin, for weak pulse. The healer watches the eyes. A man who cannot focus may be fading. The healer also watches the color of blood. Bright red, spurting, means an artery. Darker, steady, means a vein. Medieval healers did not speak in modern anatomical terms all the time, but they knew the difference in practice. They knew that a spurting wound can empty a body quickly. They might press hard with cloth. They might pack a wound. They might tie above it. They might, if they have skill, clamp and tie the vessel. They might also use cautery because heat is decisive. Now let's pause at the tool roll, because this is where the phrase Sawbones begins to feel real. The tools are not many, but each has a job. A small knife for precise cutting, a larger knife for opening, a probe to explore, a needle for stitching, a pair of forceps for grasping, a spoon-like instrument for scraping, a small hook, a saw, a drill, and sometimes cupping glasses, because cupping was used to draw blood or bad humors to the surface. Sometimes leeches, kept in a small container, used for bloodletting in a controlled way. The idea of bloodletting can sound strange to modern ears, but remember that in medieval medical theory, blood could be excess, could be overheated, could be part of an imbalance. And sometimes, reducing pressure did provide relief. The danger was not the idea of adjusting the body's state, but the lack of understanding of when it helped and when it harmed. The healer's kit also includes non-metal things: wax, resin, oil, fat, cloth, string. Wax and resin can be used to make salves and plasters. Oil can soften and protect skin. Fat mixed with herbs can carry those herbs into a wound. Cloth is the universal tool because it can compress, it can cover, it can tie, it can cushion. A battlefield hospital is in many ways a cloth economy. Cloth becomes life. Cloth becomes time because pressure buys time. Cloth becomes dignity because a covered wound feels less exposed. Now imagine the healer's workspace. It is crowded and yet it has zones. There is the triage edge. There is the central table. There is the wash area. There is the quiet corner for the dying where a priest can speak without shouting. There is the fire area where the iron heats and water boils. There is the storage area where clean cloth is guarded like treasure. There is the waste area where bloody water is dumped, where used cloth piles up, where the smell is sharp. Even without official planning, humans create zones. It is how we cope with complexity. Let's step into the wash area, because here you see one of the most important things medieval care could do: reduce filth. The assistant pours water into a basin. Maybe it is warm, maybe not. The surgeon's hands enter the water, and he rubs them with ash or sand to abrade away grime. He rinses. He dries on cloth. He does this because he wants grip, and because he wants cleanliness, and because he has learned that wounds treated with cleaner hands do better. It is not germ theory. It is observation. It is the beginning of hygiene. The assistant also washes the patient's skin around the wound. Dirt is removed. Hair is trimmed away. Clothing is cut, not pulled, because pulling hurts and can disturb clots. Cutting clothing is a small act of mercy. It is also practical, because cloth fibers can be driven into wounds by impact, becoming hidden irritants. Medieval healers noticed this. They tried to remove foreign matter. They used probes and forceps and careful fingers. Now let's look at a common medieval weapon injury: the arrow wound. Arrows are not all the same. Some are narrow and designed to penetrate mail. Some are broadhead designed to cut. Some have barbs. When an arrow enters flesh, the shaft is often snapped for transport, leaving the head inside. Removing it depends on the type. If it is a simple head, it might be pulled back through the entry wound. If it is barbed, pulling back can tear. In some cases, surgeons used an instrument that slid along the shaft to cover the barbs, allowing withdrawal with less tearing. In other cases, they enlarged the wound with a knife to remove the head. This sounds brutal, but sometimes enlarging a wound is less damaging than ripping blindly. Again, the healer is choosing between harms. After removal, the wound is washed. Wine, vinegar, boiled water if possible. Then the healer decides: close or drain. Deep punctures often are left open or loosely covered because drainage is important. A closed, deep pocket can trap infection. Medieval healers talked about corruption and putrefaction. They knew trapped fluids could turn bad, so they might insert a small strip of cloth as a drain. They might apply a poultice. They might bandage in a way that allows seepage. Now, another classic injury, the sword cut. A clean blade can make a clean cut. That is, ironically, better than a crushing blow. A clean cut can be stitched. The surgeon aligns the edges, stitches, ties off. He might apply a salve. He might cover with cloth. He might instruct the patient to keep it clean, which in a camp is a difficult instruction but still given. The patient might be told to avoid exertion, to avoid strain, because strain can reopen the cut. Then there are the crush injuries, and these are where medieval surgery becomes most grim. A mace, a club, a hammer, the hoof of a horse, all can crush. The skin might not break much, but the tissue beneath is damaged. Swelling rises, blood pools, the limb becomes tight, pain becomes deep. If circulation is compromised, the limb can die. Medieval healers recognized this. They might try to reduce swelling with cool compresses. They might elevate the limb. They might lance to relieve pressure. And sometimes they amputate. We have already seen amputation, but we can slow down and understand the full sequence because it is a sequence of choices. The healer first examines, is there sensation in the limb? Is there pulse? Is the skin warm? Is there movement? If the limb is cold, insensate, and discolored, it may already be dying. If it is shattered and bone protrudes, infection risk is high. The healer weighs time and resources. If amputation is done, it must be done quickly and decisively. Preparations are made. The patient is given drink. Assistants restrain. The tourniquet is applied. The incision is made. The saw cuts. The vessels are addressed with pressure, tying, or cautery. The stump is dressed. The hospital's relationship with pain is complicated. Medieval people lived with pain in a way that modern medicine has reduced. But that does not mean they were indifferent to it. Pain was feared. Pain was also sometimes interpreted morally. Enduring pain could be seen as brave, as virtuous, as a form of penance. Yet healers tried to reduce it when they could because a patient in agony thrashes, and thrashing makes surgery harder. So drink is used. Herbs are used. In some stories, patients are knocked unconscious with a blow. That is not ideal. But in desperate moments, people do desperate things. More often, restraint and speed are the tools. Now, let's talk about cauterization in a broader way, because it is not just about sealing. Heat was also used to counteract corruption. The idea that heat could cleanse was intuitive. Fire purifies. Fire sterilizes in a limited sense. Medieval healers sometimes applied hot irons to ulcers to stop spreading infection. They also used heat in a more subtle way. Warm compresses, heated stones wrapped in cloth, because warmth can soothe and improve circulation. The healer is not always burning. Sometimes the healer is warming. We should also acknowledge the role of smell in medieval diagnosis. In a time before laboratory tests, Senses were diagnostic tools. The healer smells breath. Sweet breath might suggest certain metabolic issues, though not named. The healer smells wounds. The healer smells urine. The healer tastes sometimes because taste was part of humoral assessment. This sounds strange, but in a sensory world the body is read through senses. In the hospital, smell is everywhere and it teaches. A wound that begins to smell changes treatment. A patient whose breath becomes foul may be considered close to death. A patient whose sweat smells different may be noted. The healer's nose is part of his craft. Now, as the first night passes, the hospital does not quiet so much as settle. The initial chaos becomes routine. The assistant learns where to stand. The nurse learns which patients need water and which need quiet. The priest learns which men are ready to speak and which want silence. The surgeon learns where his tools are in the dark by memory. The firekeeper learns how to keep coals steady, not blazing. The boy learns how to move without tripping. All of this is adaptation. It is civilization in miniature. And in that miniature civilization, you see the medieval world structure: hierarchy, faith, craft, community. You see the noble patient treated with extra care, yes. You also see the common soldier given a blanket by a stranger, because suffering makes kinship. You see the healer scold an assistant for wasting cloth, because cloth is life. You see the nurse hush a man who is shouting, not because he is wrong, but because panic spreads. You see the priest whisper, because sometimes whispering is more powerful than preaching. Now, let's follow one more day, because the hospital is not done when the blood stops flowing. The second day is about inflammation. The body responds to injury with swelling, heat, pain. Medieval healers expected this. They spoke of heat in the wound. They might recommend cooling foods. They might apply cool compresses. They might encourage rest. They might also bleed a patient to reduce perceived heat. Sometimes that would weaken a patient. Sometimes it might relieve pressure. The results varied, and the healer's reputation depended on outcomes. The second day is also about infection emerging. A wound that looked clean on the first night may begin to redden on the second. A patient who seemed stable may develop fever. The healer checks. He decides whether to reopen a wound, to drain it, to wash again. He decides whether to change a poultice. He decides whether to isolate a patient who smells wrong, though isolation is hard. He decides whether to move a patient closer to fresh air. Medieval people often believed that bad air, miasma, caused disease. They did not know germs, but they did observe that crowded, foul places were dangerous. So fresh air was sought. A patient might be placed near a doorway. A tent flap might be opened. Smoke might be used to drive away flies and bad air. These are imperfect measures, but they are attempts. The second day is also about sleep. Some patients finally sleep. Their bodies, exhausted, drop into heavy rest. Others cannot. Pain keeps them awake. Nightmares come. Battle memories replay. Medieval people did not have the modern concept of PTSD, but trauma existed. A man might wake screaming. He might cling to a friend. A priest might interpret nightmares as spiritual attack. A healer might interpret them as fever delirium. In either case, the response is similar: comfort, water, prayer, perhaps herbs. The third day, if the hospital still exists, is about decisions. Who can travel? Who must remain? Who is getting worse? A commander might push the army to move, and the hospital must pack. This is where medieval war becomes particularly cruel. The wounded are a logistical problem. If they are valuable nobles, they travel. If they are common soldiers, they may be left. Yet, leaving does not always mean abandonment. Local communities might take them. Monasteries might accept them. Sometimes, families in nearby villages would nurse a stranger because Christian charity demanded it, or because they feared punishment if they refused. In other cases, the wounded are left with minimal supplies and a prayer, and many die. When the hospital moves, it becomes smaller. The clean cloth is packed, the tools are wrapped, the pots are emptied, the fire is stamped out, the straw is left, and the ground, stained and trampled, becomes a silent witness. If you walk that ground days later, you might find scraps of cloth, a broken splint, a dropped needle, a dark patch where blood soaked. These are the archaeology of care. Now, if we follow the wounded who are transported, we might see the next stage. The monastery infirmary, the town hospital, the Lord's Hall turned into a ward. Here, care becomes less frantic and more sustained. Beds, even if simple, regular meals, clean water, more stable warmth. In some medieval hospitals, rules existed for nursing, bathing patients, changing linens, giving specific diets. Many hospitals were run by religious orders, and their discipline could improve outcomes. Even without antibiotics, clean rest can heal astonishingly well. This is also where long-term disability enters the story. A man who survives an amputation needs a way to move. Medieval prosthetics were simple but real. A wooden peg, a crutch, a cane. Some wealthy patients could afford more. A crafted wooden leg with straps, an iron brace, a hook for a hand. Artifacts and illustrations suggest that prostheses existed, especially for those who had resources. Even without a prosthesis, people adapted. Communities adapted. A man who lost a hand might become a watchman rather than a plowman. A man who lost a leg might work as a clerk if he could read, or might beg, or might be cared for by kin. Medieval society had charity structures for the disabled, often through the church, though it was uneven. Disability was common enough that people had social scripts for it. It was not an anomaly. It was part of life. And now, let's return again to the battlefield hospital, but with this wider sense of what it means. It is not only a place of screaming, it is a hinge between war and life. It is where the body's story changes direction. It is where a soldier becomes a survivor, or becomes a corpse, or becomes something in between. A living man with a new body. The hospital's day-to-day routine, when it persists, becomes remarkably structured. Morning, check bandages, give food, wash faces, clean the space, boil water, prepare herbs. Midday, change dressings for those whose wounds are draining. Check splints, assist those who need to relieve themselves, because toileting is a huge challenge for immobile patients. In the medieval hospital, chamber pots matter, buckets matter, clean straw matters. Nurses, often women, do this work. Afternoon, treat fevers, cool foreheads, offer drinks, listen to complaints, adjust pillows. Evening, prepare for cold, stock the fire, change the most urgent bandages before dark. Night, quiet watch, respond to sudden bleeding, respond to delirium, respond to the dying. The dying are always present. Medieval death rituals were intimate. A dying man might want confession. He might want a priest to hear his last words. He might want to make a small will to tell who gets his belt, his knife, his coins. A clerk might write these words on parchment. A friend might memorize them if no clerk is present. The hospital is therefore also a legal and social space, where possessions move, where promises are made, where last messages are carried. Now, let's slow down and notice small details again, because that is the heart of a sleep story. A candle stub burned low, dripping wax. A bowl with a cracked rim. A strip of linen knotted at one end for easy untying. A wooden spoon used to feed broth. A leather water flask. The sound of a whetstone on a blade. SHHH, SHHH, steady. The sigh of a patient who finally feels the bandage loosened. The soft scraping of a broom as someone sweeps straw. The distant call of a guard. The rustle of a tent flap. The soft clink as a cup is set down. Even the language of the hospital has its own rhythm. Hold him, more light. Water, press here, breathe. Stay still. It's almost done. You're doing well. God be with you. These phrases repeat because repeating calms. The healer uses repetition as a tool. The nurse uses repetition. The priest uses repetition. And the patient, too, repeats, "Mother, Jesus, please, I'm cold, I'm thirsty, don't leave." The hospital is a chorus of repeated human needs. Now, because we are building a long, immersive narrative, we can allow ourselves to drift into a wider historical atmosphere without turning into a textbook. Imagine the medieval landscape beyond the tent, fields divided by hedges, small villages with thatched roofs, a stone church with a bell tower, a road lined with mud and wagon ruts. This is the world that supplies the hospital. The herbs come from those hedges. The linen comes from village looms. The wine comes from regional vines. The wood comes from nearby forests. The medieval battlefield hospital is not isolated. It is plugged into the economy of ordinary people. The hospital also reflects medieval ideas about the body and the soul. The body is seen as a vessel, a temporary house. The soul is eternal. This can make pain easier to endure because pain is temporary. It can also make suffering meaningful, which is a comfort. But it can also create fear because death is a judgment. A wounded man might worry not only about his body, but about his sins. He might worry about dying unconfessed. So the priest's presence is as medically important as the surgeon's in a psychological sense. The priest reduces panic. The priest offers a narrative. The surgeon offers a physical chance. Together they create hope. Now let's spend some time with the idea of herbal remedies in the hospital, because it is easy to dismiss them, but they were a major part of medieval care. Herbs were not used randomly. There were traditions and texts, but also local knowledge. Some herbs were used for their astringency to help stop bleeding, others for their soothing properties, others for their scent, because scent was thought to influence health. Herbs were used in teas, poultices, salves, baths. A poultice might be warmed and placed on a wound to draw out badness. A tea might be given to calm. A bath might be used if possible, though in a battlefield setting baths are rare. In monastic infirmaries, baths were more common because the infrastructure existed. Tubs, water supply, heated rooms. Honey, again, deserves attention. In medieval care, honey is used as a wound dressing. It keeps the wound moist. It inhibits some bacterial growth. It reduces odor. Modern science has confirmed some of this, though medieval people did not need confirmation. They had observation. Honey was also used internally in drinks for sore throats and energy. Honey was one of the few sweeteners available, and it was valued. In a camp, honey is precious. Using it on a wound is a choice. It is an investment in a patient's survival. Wine and vinegar are also important. They are used as antiseptics, but also as carriers for herbs. Vinegar can be infused with herbs, making a sharp medicinal wash. Wine can be warmed and used to clean. Alcohol provides some antimicrobial effect. It also relaxes patients. Again, imperfect but better than nothing. Now, as we continue, we can imagine the hospital facing a secondary crisis. Rain. Rain turns the ground to mud. Mud tracks into wounds. Wet cloth becomes heavy and cold. Fires struggle. The hospital must adapt. Tents leak. Straw becomes damp. Patients shiver. Hypothermia becomes a threat, especially for those who have lost blood. Healers prioritize warmth. They move patients closer to fires. They cover them. They use heated stones wrapped in cloth. They give warm drinks. The smell of wet wool fills the tent. The sound of rain on canvas becomes a steady drum, almost soothing in another context, but here it is a hazard. Still in the rhythm of a sleep story, we can let that rain sound become gentle, a reminder that time moves, that the world continues beyond human conflict. If the weather is hot instead, the hospital faces a different crisis. Thirst and flies. Flies land on wounds. They lay eggs. The healers wave them away constantly, using branches, cloth, smoke. They might hang aromatic herbs near the patients to deter insects. They might burn certain resins. They might keep doors covered with cloth. They might move patients to breezier areas. Again, these are small, imperfect defenses. And now, let's touch briefly on something that is often overlooked: the care of horses. Medieval warfare depended on horses, and horses were injured too. A battlefield camp might include farriers and horse doctors. While our story focuses on human patients, the presence of animal care nearby adds to the atmosphere. The smell of hay, the sound of a horse snorting, the clink of a horseshoe. In some cases, a healer might treat a horse wound with similar salves and bandages, because basic care principles apply. This reminds us that medieval medicine was not separated into neat categories. It was part of a practical world of bodies. Now, we can let our narrative become even more gentle and slow by repeating our tour through the tent with a slightly different focus, like walking through the same place again, but noticing new details. We pass the table and see the grooves in the wood where fluids have soaked and been scrubbed away. We see the rope used to tie a tourniquet, coiled like a sleeping snake. We see the pile of cloth strips, folded in a careful stack. We see the mortar and pestle, stained green from crushed leaves. We see a small jar of resin, dark and sticky. We see a wooden cup with a chipped lip. We see a candle holder made from a bent nail. We see a small iron hook hanging from a tent pole, holding a lantern. We see a knife laid on cloth, its edge reflecting firelight. We hear the same sounds again, but softer now. The slow breathing of sleeping men, the occasional groan, the murmur of a nurse, the quiet clink of a spoon, the gentle creak as someone shifts on straw. We smell the same scents, but our mind adjusts. Smoke, herbs, sweat, vinegar. We feel the temperature changes. Warm near the fire, cool near the tent edge. We notice the way the light shifts from orange at the fire to blue-gray at the doorway. The medieval hospital is a place of gradients, not bright categories. And as you continue to rest, listening to this story, you might notice that your own breath can mirror the hospital's rhythm. Inhale like the rise of the fire. Exhale like the settling of straw. The hospital's chaos becomes, in our safe retelling, a calm pattern. Care, clean, bandage, rest. Care, clean, bandage, rest. Now we will not romanticize suffering. The hospital is not a gentle place, but it is a place where gentleness is practiced. That contrast is important. In a world where violence was common, the act of washing a wound is an act of resistance. The act of feeding broth is an act of resistance. The act of sitting with the dying is an act of resistance. Medieval people did not use that language, but the impulse is there. As the days pass and the hospital eventually dissolves, the memory of it remains in the bodies that survive. A scar across a cheek, a limp, a missing finger, a stiff shoulder. These marks become part of the medieval landscape because war was frequent. When you picture a medieval village, picture not only healthy peasants, but also men with old injuries, women with old illnesses, children with scars. The medieval world is a world of resilience. People carried damage and still lived. And in that sense, the medieval battlefield hospital is not only history. It is a reminder that human beings have always tried to heal each other, even with limited tools, even in terrible conditions. Tonight, we have visited that effort slowly, gently, with respect. And we will continue a little longer because there are still more quiet corners to explore. Let's go deeper into those quiet corners, because they are where the hospital feels most like a living place, and also where a sleep story can become soft and steady. There is, for example, the corner where the most stable patients are gathered, the ones who can talk, the ones who can sit, the ones who are no longer bleeding actively. This corner is quieter not because it is painless, but because it has rhythm. Here, a nurse can move from person to person, changing cloth, offering sips, adjusting splints, helping men shift positions so their backs do not stiffen. Here, conversation happens, not loud but murmured, because people in pain speak softly. You might hear a man describing the moment he fell. "I didn't see it," he says. "I was running and then my leg just gave." Another man says, "I thought I was dead. I thought I was done." Another says nothing, staring into the air because his mind is still on the field. A nurse listens without judging. Listening is part of care. It keeps the wounded anchored. In another corner is the herbal station, which we have glimpsed, but now we can linger. The herbalist's tools are humble: a mortar and pestle, a knife, a small board for chopping. Bundles of dried plants hang from a pole or lie in a basket. Some are common, gathered from nearby fields. Some are precious, carried from afar. Dried lavender, if available, for calm. Dried calendula for skin. Resin from pine for sticky plasters. The herbalist works like a cook, measuring by feel, by scent, by memory. She does not have a laboratory. She has experience. She makes a poultice for swelling, crushed plantain, a little vinegar wrapped in cloth. She makes a salve for a burn, fat mixed with beeswax and a soothing herb. She makes a tea for fever, willow bark and mint. She makes something bitter for the stomach. She also makes a simple sweet drink with honey and water, because the wounded need energy, and sweetness is comfort. Nearby, A pot of water is always heating, because boiled water is one of the best tools the hospital has. Even if the healer does not know why boiled water is safer, the healer knows it helps. Boiling changes the taste, changes the smell. It feels cleaner. Boiling also allows herbs to infuse. The pot becomes the heart of the nursing station, like a hearth in a home. People gather near it for warmth. The hospital at this moment is not only a clinic, it is a temporary household. Now, let's consider another kind of injury, one that is not dramatic but deeply dangerous. The wound that becomes infected slowly, the one that looks fine at first and then turns. Medieval healers watched for this with a sense of dread. A patient might be stable on the first night and then on the second or third begin to shiver. Fever rises. The eyes become bright. The skin becomes hot. The wound becomes red and swollen. The patient complains of deep pain. The smell changes. The healer knows in his bones that something invisible is working. What can the healer do? He can open the wound to drain. He can wash it again and again. He can apply honey. He can apply resins and herbs believed to fight corruption. He can keep the patient hydrated. He can cool the patient with damp cloths. He can hope. He can pray. Sometimes, despite everything, the patient worsens. The hospital becomes a place of watching as much as doing. In that watching, medieval people practiced patience. The modern world often expects immediate results. Medieval healing was slow. It was days and weeks. It was waiting for swelling to go down, for fever to break, for flesh to granulate and close. This is why so much medieval care focused on regimen: food, rest, warmth, cleanliness. You can imagine a nurse saying, "You must eat because eating is strength." You can imagine her saying, "Sleep because sleep is repair." Let's spend time, too, with the injury of burns because the battlefield had fire. Torches, flaming arrows, burning buildings, cooking fires, boiling water. A man might stumble into a fire in exhaustion. A man might be burned by hot metal. Burns are painful and dangerous, especially if large. Medieval healers used cool water when possible, and then protective salves. They might apply fat and beeswax to seal and soothe. They might apply honey. They might cover with clean cloth. They would try to prevent the burn from drying and cracking. Infection was again the threat. Now consider eye injuries. A splinter, a blow, smoke, dust. An eye injury can disable a soldier permanently. Medieval healers had limited options. They might wash the eye with clean water. They might apply soothing herbs. They might protect it with cloth. But severe eye damage was often permanent. The hospital, then, is also a place where people begin to understand their future. A man who loses sight knows he will not return to the same life. This realization can be as painful as any wound. Here, spiritual care matters again. A priest might speak of the value of suffering, of the promise of heaven. A friend might promise to help. A nurse might simply hold a hand. These responses do not fix the eye, but they help the person. Now, because the title includes daily routine, we will give the routine a full, gentle sequence, as if we are spending an entire day inside the hospital, hour by hour, in a soft way. In the early morning, when light first comes, the nurses wake the patients who can eat. They offer small amounts: broth, soaked bread, watered wine. They do not give too much at once because nausea is common after blood loss and shock. They check mouths for dryness. They check lips. They check skin temperature. They check whether a patient is sweating. They check whether a patient is cold. They adjust blankets. The surgeon, if he has slept at all, wakes and drinks something quickly. He inspects his tools. He sharpens a blade. He checks the saw. He checks the needles. He prepares for dressings and for any procedures that were delayed by darkness. Some procedures are better done in daylight when you can see detail. A surgeon might wait until morning to stitch a complicated facial wound. He might wait to set a fracture properly. Light is a medicine. In the late morning, dressings are changed. This is one of the most unpleasant parts for patients because removing cloth can tear clots and reopen pain. Nurses soak bandages with warm water or wine to loosen them. They peel gently. They clean around the wound. They apply fresh cloth. They retie splints. They check circulation in fingers and toes. If a splint is too tight, the limb can swell and suffer. Medieval nurses learned to check for this. In midday, the hospital deals with waste. Buckets are emptied. Straw is replaced. The ground is swept. This is constant. It is never done. In a crowded space, waste accumulates quickly. The smell can become heavy, so the nurses keep moving. They might sprinkle herbs on the floor, not only for scent, but because scent is psychologically important. A place that smells less like decay feels safer. Safety helps healing. In early afternoon, the surgeon examines the worst cases again. He checks for signs of infection. He listens to breathing. He presses a hand to a forehead. He asks questions. Are you dizzy? Are you thirsty? Do you feel chills? He watches for delirium. Delirium is a sign of fever, of infection, of shock. A delirious patient might pull off bandages. He might thrash. Nurses restrain gently. They speak calm words. They offer water. They may use herbs to sedate cautiously. In late afternoon, if the hospital is near a town or monastery, supplies might arrive. Fresh linen, bread, herbs, a few eggs. If the hospital is purely in the field, supplies are whatever the army has. This affects outcomes. A well-supplied hospital can do more. A hungry hospital struggles. The wounded need food. The healers need food. A healer who is exhausted and hungry makes mistakes. So leaders who care about their men's survival sometimes allocate resources. Again, not for charity only, but for military strength. As evening approaches, the nurses try to settle patients for night. They offer a last meal. They adjust bedding. They check bandages. They encourage urination before sleep because getting up at night is hard. They keep a lamp burning because darkness makes everything harder. They also prepare for emergencies because emergencies happen at night. Bleeding starts again, fever spikes, a patient's breathing worsens. Then the night comes and we are back to the hospital's flickering interior. The soundscape changes. Daytime bustle outside quiets. Inside, whispers become more prominent. The surgeon might do 1 or 2 urgent procedures, but mostly, the night is about monitoring, about keeping people alive through the dark hours. A nurse listens for changes in breathing. She touches foreheads. She replaces damp cloth. She speaks a prayer. Now, because the title also includes tools, we can spend time on the tools as physical objects, imagining them in detail. A medieval knife has a simple handle, perhaps wood, perhaps horn. The blade is carbon steel, sharpened on stone. It must be kept dry to avoid rust. The surgeon's saw has a wooden handle, teeth that must be cleaned. A forceps is like a small claw used to grip. A probe is smooth, used to explore. A needle might be made of metal, curved, threaded with linen. The thread is waxed to reduce friction. The surgeon might keep thread in a small box to protect it from dirt. A tourniquet is simply a strip of cloth and a stick to twist. A splint is wood. A bandage is linen. A basin is clay or pewter. A lamp is oil, wick, flame. The hospital's architecture is also a tool. Tents are placed to avoid wind. Fires are placed safely away from canvas. Patients are placed based on urgency. Straw is placed to insulate. Blankets are placed for warmth. The door flap is adjusted to allow airflow, because airflow reduces smell and maybe reduces sickness. Even if the reasons are not fully understood, the effect is observed. Fresh air feels better. Crowded, stale air feels worse. So when possible, patients are moved near open flaps. In monastic hospitals, windows were important. In field tents, openness was controlled. Now let's talk about the role of sewing beyond skin. Clothing must be repaired. Blankets must be patched. Bandages must be made. Women in camp often had sewing skills. Those skills become medical. Sewing holds skin edges, but also holds a hospital together. A torn sheet becomes bandage strips. A cloak becomes a stretcher. A belt becomes a tourniquet. A scarf becomes a sling. This improvisation is medieval medicine at its core. Now, consider the screams in the title. We have already noticed that screams come in waves. Let's understand why. Pain is sharpest in certain moments. When a foreign object is removed, when a bone is set, when a limb is cut, when a burn is cleaned, when a bandage is removed from raw flesh. In between, pain becomes a steady ache. The screams are peaks. The hospital is mostly endurance. And the endurance is where survival happens. A patient who can endure the hours after surgery, who can keep breathing, who can keep drinking, who can keep a little food down, who can sleep, has a chance. The healer also endures. The surgeon's shoulders ache, his back stiffens, his eyes strain in low light, his hands cramp. He might have small cuts on his own skin from the work. Those cuts are dangerous. A surgeon might wrap his own fingers. He might try to avoid getting blood into his cuts. Again, without germ theory, he still knows that certain fluids can make him ill. He has seen other healers fall sick, so he is careful. Now, let's step outside again for a moment, because the hospital does not exist alone. It is connected to the field, to the camp, to the town. Outside, people are scavenging. They are collecting arrows. They are stripping armor. They are searching for valuables. They are tending horses. They are digging graves. The hospital's waste might be dumped in pits. The hospital's dirty water might seep into the ground. The hospital's presence changes the landscape. It creates a zone of concentrated contamination, which can attract animals, which can attract flies. So sometimes the hospital is placed slightly uphill, near a stream with waste downstream. These are practical decisions. Medieval camp leaders learned them through bitter experience. Now imagine a battlefield hospital after a siege, rather than an open field battle. In a siege, wounds accumulate over days or months. There are arrow wounds, stone injuries from catapults, burns from boiling liquids, injuries from falling. There is also disease, because siege camps are crowded and sanitation is poor. In such a context, the hospital becomes more permanent. A church might be converted into a ward. A town might establish a room for the wounded. Supplies might run low. Food might be scarce. The hospital must treat not only wounds, but also malnutrition and illness. The healer might see scurvy-like symptoms, weakness, bleeding gums. He might see dysentery. He might see respiratory illness. In a siege, the line between battlefield medicine and general public health disappears. The hospital becomes a desperate community effort. But tonight, our focus remains on the aftermath of a single battle, because that is the scene the title promises. And in that scene, the hospital is a bridge between violence and life, as we have said. So let's allow ourselves to follow the hospital's work into the evening of the second day, and then the third night, because this repetition will help the story become slow and soothing. On the second evening, the hospital is quieter than the first, but not peaceful. There are fewer new arrivals. There are more ongoing struggles: fever, swelling, pain. Nurses change cloth. The surgeon checks stumps. He checks splints. He restitches a wound that has opened. He drains an abscess that has formed. He listens to the cough of a patient with a chest injury. He knows that cough is bad. He cannot fix lungs. He can only support. The priest, too, continues. He offers prayers. He offers confession. He offers last rites. In medieval belief, dying without confession is frightening, so the priest's work is urgent. He moves between pallets, speaking softly. Some men want to talk about their life. Some want only silence. The priest adapts. Sometimes he simply sits. On the third morning, some patients are clearly recovering. Their fever is lower. Their appetite returns. Their wounds look less angry. Their eyes are less bright with illness. They can sit. They can talk. They might even laugh. Laughter in a hospital is surprising, but it happens because humans are stubborn. Other patients are clearly failing. Their breathing is shallow. Their skin is clammy. Their wounds smell bad. Their eyes are unfocused. Nurses and priests gather near them. The surgeon does less because there is less to do. This is where medieval medicine meets its limits. Now, because this is history for sleep, we can also allow ourselves a gentle educational drift, explaining why certain medieval practices were used without judging them harshly. Bloodletting, for example, is often mocked, but in a humoral framework it made sense. If fever is excess heat, removing blood seems like removing heat. If swelling is excess fluid, removing blood seems like reducing fluid. Sometimes bloodletting could harm. Sometimes, in certain conditions, it might reduce pressure. The medieval healer did not have randomized trials. He had tradition, authority, and experience. In the hospital, authority and experience sometimes clashed. The surgeon might prefer not to bleed a wounded man who is already weak. The physician might insist. Compromise might happen, a small bleed or none. The decision depends on personalities and social rank. Similarly, purging and vomiting were used to clean the body. Again, sometimes harmful. But in a world where toxins were imagined as physical substances to be expelled, it made sense. The hospital, though, often avoided heavy purging in acute trauma because a vomiting patient can aspirate, can weaken. So trauma surgery developed its own pragmatism. Now let's talk about survival in a more nuanced way. Survival is not binary. A man survives and then cannot work. He survives and then dies of infection weeks later. He survives and then carries chronic pain. He survives and then becomes a beggar. Or he survives and returns to his village and becomes a respected veteran. Medieval societies had ways of supporting disabled people, though limited. Guilds sometimes supported members. Monasteries offered alms. Families supported kin. In some cases, wounded veterans received pensions from lords or cities. Not always, but sometimes. The presence of disabled veterans is part of medieval life. Prosthetics, again, can be imagined in detail. A wooden peg leg attached with straps, a crutch carved from wood, a hand prosthesis with a simple hook or clamp. These devices are made by craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, leather workers. The hospital might connect a patient with such craftsmen, especially if the patient is noble or if a town has resources. Even common soldiers might fashion simple aids. A stick becomes a cane. A cloth sling supports an arm. Rehabilitation also exists in a simple form. A patient with a broken leg must learn to walk again. He uses a crutch. He practices. He is encouraged to move slowly because movement prevents stiffness. Medieval people understood stiffness. They might not know the physiology, but they knew that if you do not move, you become rigid. So once a fracture is stable, gentle movement is encouraged. The nurse might help. The patient might grimace, but progress happens. Now let's return to the central image of the hospital as a place of tools, because tools are calming to think about. Tools are predictable. They have a shape, a weight, a purpose. In a world of chaos, tools are order. The surgeon knows his tools. He holds them like a musician holds an instrument. He knows their balance. He knows how much pressure a knife needs to cut skin. He knows how a saw bites bone. He knows how to tie a knot that will not slip. He knows how to place a stitch so it holds without tearing. This knowledge is embodied, not theoretical. It is craft. We can also think about how the hospital teaches. An apprentice watches. He learns. He holds the lamp. He holds the patient. He sees what works and what fails. He hears the surgeon's instructions. He learns how to be calm. He learns how to move quickly without rushing. He learns how to conserve cloth. He learns how to clean a wound. This apprenticeship, repeated across centuries, is part of how surgical knowledge spreads, even without formal schooling. Now, let's speak softly about one more kind of injury: the psychological injury of war. Medieval sources sometimes describe soldiers who became mad after battle, who trembled, who could not sleep, who had visions. These might be interpreted as demonic influence, as punishment, as weakness, as trauma. The hospital might not have a category for this, but the wounded mind is present. A man might have a shallow wound and yet be shaking. He might be unable to stop crying. A nurse might give him warm drink. A priest might pray. A friend might sit with him. This is not modern therapy, but it is human presence. And presence is a kind of medicine. Now, because we need a long, soothing video, we can extend our narrative into a final, slow loop that revisits the hospital's main elements in a calm cadence. We will do it as if we are walking through the tent again and again, each time a little slower, each time noticing the same things, because repetition is comforting. We walk in. We hear the low murmur. We see the central table. We see the tools. We smell the vinegar. We see the pot of herbs. We see the nurse adjusting a bandage. We see the priest sitting with the dying. We see the boy carrying water. We see the surgeon sharpening a blade. We walk to the wash station. Water pours, hands scrub, cloth wipes. A wound is cleaned. Honey is applied. A fresh bandage is tied. We walk to the fracture corner. A leg is splinted. A sling supports an arm. A patient is told to keep still. A nurse checks toes for warmth. We walk to the triage edge. A walking wounded man receives a cloth and a knot, and an instruction to return if fever. Another man is carried in, pale, breathing shallow. The surgeon looks, then signals for the priest. The priest comes. The surgeon moves on. We walk to the fire. The iron heats. The pot simmers. The smoke curls upward. The fire keeper adds wood carefully. The light flickers. We walk to the quiet corner. A man whispers a last message. A monk nods. Someone promises to carry the message. The man exhales. We walk back to the center. The surgeon ties a stitch. The nurse offers water. The patient's eyes close. And in this repetition, the hospital becomes, in our minds, a calm structure, even though it is built on suffering. It becomes an image of care. Now, as we approach the end of this story, we can also imagine the hospital's disappearance, because medieval things often vanish. A tent is folded. Tools are packed. People move. The ground is left. Rain comes. Grass grows. In a month, the field looks almost normal. But somewhere in a nearby monastery, a man with a scar might be walking slowly, learning to move again. In a village, a man with a limp might be cutting wood. In a town, a man with a hook hand might be working as a guard. The hospital's work lives on in these bodies. And so, when you think of medieval battle, perhaps you will now also think of this quieter scene. Not only the clang of armor, but the clink of a basin. Not only the shout of victory, but the whisper of a nurse. Not only the banner, but the bandage. Not only the sword, but the needle and thread. Not only the war, but the stubborn, ordinary work of survival. Now let your mind drift. Imagine the tent's light fading. Imagine the pot's gentle simmer. Imagine the rustle of straw. Imagine the soft murmurs. Imagine the steady hands. Imagine the long medieval night becoming quiet. And as the hospital recedes, let your breathing slow and let sleep come, as gently as a blanket pulled up over your shoulders. We still have some gentle time, and we can use it to wander into the smaller practical details that make the medieval hospital feel believable. Because sometimes the smallest details are the most soothing. Think about the simple act of making a bandage. A nurse takes a length of linen, perhaps torn from a sheet or an old shirt. She tears it along the weave so it forms a straight strip. She rolls it into a neat coil, because a neat coil can be used quickly. She stacks several coils in a basket. She may sort them, narrow strips for fingers, wider for thighs. She may also make compress pads by folding cloth into squares. These pads are used to apply pressure. Pressure stops bleeding. So the nurse's folding is a kind of surgery in slow motion. Think about knots. Knots are everywhere. A bandage is only as good as its knot. A sling depends on a knot. A tourniquet is a knot. A stretcher is tied with knots. Medieval people were skilled with knots because their world used rope constantly. For animals, for loads, for nets, that rope skill becomes medical. A surgeon might tie a vessel with a ligature. A nurse might tie a splint. A boy might tie the corner of a cloth to hang it. These knots are small acts of order in chaos. Now consider the making of splints. A splint is usually wood because wood is available. A branch is cut, stripped of bark. It is smoothed quickly with a knife. Straw or cloth is wrapped around it to prevent splinters and to cushion. Then it is placed along the limb and tied. If a leg is fractured, 2 splints might be placed, one on each side and tied at intervals. The nurse checks circulation by touching toes, by watching color. If toes turn blue, the ties are loosened. This is nursing knowledge, learned through experience. Now consider the making of a simple plaster. Medieval healers used plasters that were sticky mixtures applied to cloth and then placed over wounds or joints. Resin from pine can be warmed and mixed with oil. Beeswax can be melted and mixed with fat. Herbs can be ground and stirred in. The mixture is spread on cloth, then cooled slightly so it will not burn skin, then applied. Plasters can help hold edges of a wound, protect skin, reduce movement, and give a sense of support. Even if the exact chemistry is not known, the physical effect is real. A plaster makes the wound feel contained. Now think about the role of alcohol in the hospital. Ale, beer, wine, mead. These are not only for morale. They are also safer than some water sources because fermentation reduces pathogens. In the medieval camp, people drank watered wine or ale often. The wounded, when given small amounts, are receiving hydration and calories. Alcohol also relaxes muscles, which helps bone setting. It dulls pain. Of course, too much is dangerous, but in measured amounts, it is a useful tool. A nurse might bring a cup and say, "Small sips." The patient might beg for more. The nurse might refuse. This negotiation is part of care. Now consider the hospital's relationship with light. Light is always scarce. Candles are precious, made of tallow or beeswax. Tallow candles smoke and smell. Beeswax candles burn cleaner but are expensive. Torches are smoky and harsh. Oil lamps exist, but oil is also precious. So the hospital uses light carefully. A candle might be reserved for the surgeon's table. A nurse might carry a small lamp to check a patient's face. Shadows dominate. In shadows, the mind imagines worse. So nurses and priests use voice to calm because voice is a kind of light. Now consider sound. The hospital is loud in bursts, quiet in between. The loud bursts are obvious. Cries, urgent commands, the sudden rush of footsteps. The quiet is the constant background. Breathing, the crackle of fire, the soft clink of a bowl, the rustle of cloth. If you let your mind focus on those quiet sounds, they become almost rhythmic. Crackle, pour, rustle, breathe. Crackle, pour, rustle, breathe. This rhythm is the rhythm of care. Now consider smell again, because smell is memory, vinegar's sharpness, wine's sour sweetness, honey's warm floral note, herb's green bitterness, smoke's dry bite, wet wool's heaviness, sweat's salt, dirt's dampness. These smells layer. Medieval people were used to layered smells. The hospital's smells are intense, but they also signal action. Vinegar means cleaning, smoke means warmth, herbs mean care, honey means dressing. Smell becomes a language. Now consider the hospital's social codes. A noble might have privacy, but privacy is limited. A common soldier might be surrounded by others. Shame exists. Men might be embarrassed to be seen weak, to cry, to soil themselves. Nurses deal with this gently. They might speak firmly, reminding men that injury is not dishonor. Priests reinforce this, framing suffering as part of life's trial. In a world that values martial strength, the hospital is a place where vulnerability is unavoidable. And yet, vulnerability does not destroy people. It makes them human. Now consider how information flows. Messages are carried in and out. A commander asks, "How many can return?" The surgeon answers cautiously. A soldier asks, "Is my brother here?" A nurse searches. A priest writes a letter for a dying man. A clerk notes names. These communications are part of the hospital's function. In the medieval world, where literacy is not universal, the hospital becomes a site of mediated speech. Someone writes for someone else, someone interprets, someone carries news. A letter from a battlefield hospital might be the last record of a person. Now consider the relationship between healer and patient as a relationship of trust under pressure. The patient must allow the healer to touch, to cut, to cause pain for the sake of healing. The healer must be worthy of that trust. Some healers were charlatans, some were incompetent, but many were skilled. Skilled healers earned reputation. In medieval communities, reputation mattered. A surgeon who saved lives would be sought. A surgeon who killed unnecessarily would be feared. On a battlefield, there is no time to choose carefully, so trust is sometimes forced. The healer's steady voice becomes essential. "Look at me," he might say, "breathe, hold still, you will live." Even when he cannot guarantee it, the promise itself can give strength. Now, let's take a gentle step into the question of how medieval healers understood infection without microbes. They spoke of corruption, putrefaction, bad humors, poison. They believed that certain substances could rot inside the body. They believed that foul smells could cause illness. They believed that wounds exposed to dirty air could worsen. Some of these beliefs were wrong in mechanism, but not always wrong in practice. Keeping wounds clean, keeping air fresh, draining pus, avoiding stagnant filth, these practices help. So medieval miasma theory sometimes led to helpful actions. The hospital might be placed upwind. The tent flaps might be opened. Herbs might be burned to sweeten air. Even if the reason is miasma, the effect can be improved ventilation and insect deterrence. Now consider the role of heat and cold. Medieval medicine believed that heat and moisture were associated with certain illnesses. Fever is heat, inflammation is heat, so cooling is used, cool cloth, cool drinks, shade. But cold is also dangerous because it can weaken, so the nurse balances. A feverish patient might be cooled, but kept warm enough to avoid chilling. A bleeding patient might be kept warm to prevent shock. This balancing act is constant and requires observation. It is not theory only, it is practice. Now consider the hospital's relationship with time. Medieval time is measured by daylight and bells. A monastery might ring bells for prayers. Matins in the night, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. In a hospital attached to a monastery, these bells structure the day. A nurse hears the bell and knows it is time for certain tasks. A priest hears it and prays. A patient hears it and feels anchored. In a field camp without bells, time is still structured by routine. Morning wash, midday meal, evening checks. Routine is time made predictable. Now, let's imagine the end of the hospital's busiest phase and the beginning of the slower phase of convalescence. Some patients are moved to a more stable building. Maybe it is a farmhouse. Maybe it is a village hall. Maybe it is the infirmary of a monastery. The atmosphere changes. There is less noise. There are more beds. There is more air. Wounds are still painful, but fear is less sharp. Nurses can focus on feeding, on cleaning, on gentle movement. The surgeon visits rather than staying constantly. The priest continues. In this quieter phase, healing becomes visible. Swelling reduces, bruises change color, wounds scab, stitches hold, bones knit. In this phase, diet becomes central. Medieval healers believed strongly in diet as medicine. They recommended certain foods for certain conditions, warm broths for weakness, light foods for fever, avoiding heavy meat when the body is hot, using spices to warm the stomach. Again, the humoral framework shapes recommendations. But beyond theory, nutrition matters. Protein supports tissue repair. Calories support energy. Fluids support circulation. So the medieval emphasis on food is in many cases practical. Now consider the simple act of drinking from a cup. A patient with a broken arm cannot lift a cup. A nurse must help. A patient with facial wounds might struggle to swallow. A patient with fever might be thirsty but weak. So the nurse holds the cup, tilts it carefully, wipes the chin. These small actions take time. Time is nursing. Nursing is time. Now imagine one final scene, a gentle one that captures the hospital's purpose without returning to screams. A wounded man sits up on a pallet, supported by straw and cloth. His leg is splinted. His bandage is clean. He is eating bread. He looks toward the tent opening where sunlight spills in. He can hear the camp outside. He can smell smoke and food. He can feel for the first time since the battle that he might live. A nurse adjusts the splint and says, "Easy." A priest nods at him. The surgeon glances over, tired, but with a small satisfaction. This is survival in its simplest form: breath, food, light, care. And now, as we bring our story to its final rest, let the medieval hospital become distant again, like an image fading at the edge of sleep. You can keep the soft details: the pot simmering, the rustle of cloth, the steady hands. You can let go of the sharper sounds. You can remember that history is not only castles and crowns. It is also bandages and broth. It is also the quiet craft of keeping someone alive through a long, cold night. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the candle light in the tent dim. Let the murmurs become a gentle hum. Let the medieval world drift away, and let sleep come, steady and safe. And because we still have a little time to reach the long, drifting pace we want, we can add one last slow pass through the hospital's evening, focusing on the routine the way you might focus on the repetition of waves on a shore. Imagine the sun lowering again on the second or third day. The light outside turns honey-colored. Shadows stretch. The camp's energy shifts from movement to settling. In the hospital, nurses begin their evening checklist. They do it almost automatically now. They check each patient's bandage and retie knots that have loosened. They touch foreheads feeling for fever. They look for shivering, a sign of chill or infection. They offer water in small sips. They offer food, because hunger returns even in injury, and hunger is a good sign. They help those who must use the bucket, because dignity matters. They sweep straw and replace the damp parts. The surgeon, too, has an evening pattern. He inspects his most fragile patients first. He checks the stump of an amputee, looking for swelling and smell. He checks a deep puncture wound, looking for redness spreading. He checks a fracture, ensuring the splint has not shifted. He listens to a chest-injured man's breathing, counting the rhythm. He speaks quietly, not making promises. He gives instructions to the nurses. Change this in the night. Watch him. Keep him warm. If he bleeds, press here and call me. Near the fire, the assistant warms water again, because warm water is needed for loosening dressings and making tea. The herbalist prepares a final infusion for the night, something mild, calming, chamomile if available, mint, a little honey. The smell rises and fills the tent with a gentle sweetness. Even the wounded notice. A man who has been tense all day relaxes his shoulders for a moment as he drinks. The priest, as evening prayer time approaches, speaks softly. He might recite familiar words. Familiar words are another kind of medicine. They give structure. They give meaning. Some patients mouth the words even if they are too weak to speak. Others simply listen. In the medieval world, prayer is like breathing. It is part of life. Then night arrives again. The hospital's lamps become small islands in shadow. Nurses move carefully so they do not wake those who finally sleep. They do not speak loudly unless they must. They listen. Listening is their main tool at night. A change in breathing. A sudden rustle that signals a patient is restless. A soft groan that signals a bandage is too tight. They respond in small ways. A blanket adjusted, a cloth dampened and placed on a forehead, a sip of water, a whispered reassurance. And through it all, the fire continues its steady work. Crackle, pop, soft hiss. The pot's surface trembles. The iron, if needed, is kept warm. The air is warm near the fire, cooler near the tent wall. The tent canvas shifts with a breeze. Straw settles under bodies. The rhythm repeats, repeating not as drama but as care. If you let your mind rest on that rhythm, it becomes almost hypnotic. Check, adjust, sip, cover, clean. Check, adjust, sip, cover, clean. The medieval battlefield hospital in our retelling becomes not a place to fear, but a place to witness the human instinct to help. And now, with that final rhythm in your mind, let the hospital dim. Let the lamps fade. Let the voices soften until they are only a murmur behind a closed door. Let the medieval world dissolve into darkness, and let sleep, quiet and steady, take its place. One more small, gentle detail, like a final stitch in the fabric of the night. In the corner of the hospital, there is a basket of clean cloth, guarded almost like treasure. A nurse reaches into it with clean hands, choosing a strip that is soft and unfrayed. She wraps it around a patient's wrist where the skin is chafed, not a battle wound, just the irritation of straps and movement. The patient looks surprised that anyone would care about something so small. But small discomforts matter when everything hurts. The nurse ties a knot, neat and secure. Nearby, another nurse takes a moment to smooth a man's hair back from his forehead before placing a cool cloth there. The man's eyes flutter. He exhales. In that quiet exhale is the whole purpose of the hospital. A little less pain, a little more steadiness, a small pocket of relief. And outside, beyond the tent, the medieval night continues. The grass moves in the wind. The stars wheel overhead. The camp's fires burn lower. The field, scarred by battle, begins its slow return to ordinary earth. And inside the tent, under dim light, the work of care continues in soft repetition, until even that repetition fades in your imagination, and your own rest becomes the final, peaceful scene. If you like, you can imagine the last sound you hear in the hospital before sleep fully takes you. Not a scream, not a command, but the simple splash of water in a bowl as someone rinses cloth. Splash, pause, splash. Then the soft twist of fabric being wrung out. Then the gentle clink as the bowl is set down. These are the quiet sounds of repair, the sounds of a world trying in its limited way to mend what has been broken. Hold that sound for a moment and then let it drift away, like a candle flame shrinking to a warm dot, and then to darkness. Sleep now safely and slowly, as the story ends for tonight.